What up, YouTube? So today I wanted to go over a couple of things. The first thing is recall from before where I had this passenger side downpipe hanging down too close to the ground, and I've actually dealt with that. As you can see on the right hand side, I had a company in Albuquerque called Ultimate Performance. They rerouted this pipe to go over the steering rack kind of through here. I don't know if you can see. Before it just kind of went underneath the A-arm, so now it doesn't even, you can't see it at all. So it's pretty nice now. But also, I don't know if you can tell, but right here we have an exhaust cutout. So since I was modifying the downpipe, I decided just to add in this exhaust cutout while I was doing that. And I wanted to talk to you about the effects of the exhaust cutout. Does it help with power? What exactly does it do? So it turns out that I was able to dyno it before and after the exhaust cutout, or actually a couple of dynos with the exhaust valve closed and with the exhaust valve open. So I wanted to kind of go over that first. So here's another shot of the new downpipe. So it kind of goes over the steering rack, kind of through the K-member area, and back down into the it'll attach here into this exhaust. The wrapping needs to, this was before the wrapping was done, so it looks better now. So this is what the downpipe looked like before the reroute of the downpipe. It was hanging very close to the ground, so what we did was sort of modify this, add in the exhaust valve, exhaust cutout I should say, and then route it back up around and down back into the exhaust. And obviously it fixed the problem of clearance. You guys might ask, how much horsepower can you gain? So I want to talk to you about this wastegate. In the previous video I didn't show a picture of the wastegate. So here's the TurboSmart 38mm wastegate that we see here. There's a pipe here that's curving towards the driver's side, and as you notice, it's kind of hitting the exhaust gas is actually hitting the power steering rack and turning it black. That's something that I didn't like, so I had to reroute this and kind of bring it down and towards the back. However, now it's actually hitting the oil pan, so what I want to do next is route it downward towards the ground so it won't touch anything with the car. So I'm going to do that next. On the topic, let's talk about the effects of the exhaust cutout. They're actually more pronounced than what I was expecting. So here we see a couple of things. We see two curves. The first curve in red is with the exhaust valve open, and the second curve in the blue is with the exhaust valve closed. So obviously at higher RPM we're getting quite a bit more horsepower in comparison to middle and lower RPM where the difference isn't that much. If we go to the torque, so here's the horsepower on top, the torque is right here. Again, we are seeing a little bit of torque difference at lower RPM. And then when we get to the RPM where the peak torque occurs, we actually see that there's hardly any differences at all, which is kind of surprising, and I'll show you why that is in a minute. Peak torque is a lot higher at higher RPM with the exhaust valve open. Okay, so what's interesting here is we're seeing this is the boost curve, so this is boost pressure versus our engine RPM. And what we notice is for all RPM, the boost curve with the exhaust cutout open is actually shifted up by at least between 1 and 3 psi, depending on RPM. So in the mid-range, we're getting about 2 psi difference, maybe 1.5 to 2. And then obviously in higher RPMs we're getting a large difference in boost pressure. The differences in horsepower that we're seeing is really due to the increase in boost pressure, at least from what I'm seeing. However, what's very interesting is because the boost pressure with the exhaust cutout open is actually higher always, we would expect that the horsepower and torque should be higher as well. We're not seeing that. We're actually seeing, if you recall, there really is no difference until you get to higher RPM. That doesn't make too much sense to me, and I think really it's just the tune. The tune is really designed for the without any exhaust cutout, so it's just flowing through the stock exhaust, not stock exhaust, but the the standard exhaust flow. So I think with a new tune that kind of accounts for the exhaust cutout, hopefully we'll be able to see a larger difference for all RPM, since the boost pressure is higher for all RPM. So what's interesting is because the boost pressure curve when the exhaust cutout is open, well, that means that the turbo is actually spooling up quicker. So that's a very good news. And what's also interesting is with the exhaust cutout open, you can actually, it's much louder, the engine is much louder, and you can hear the turbo spool up much better as well. I installed this exhaust cutout primarily for higher horsepower. For the stock 3 valve, you kind of reach a horsepower plateau no matter how much more boost you put in. That's really due to the exhaust restrictions. And to get to 1,000, you really need to either change up your exhaust or add an exhaust cutout. The exhaust cutout pretty much adds maybe 100 to 200 horsepower when you get up in the 20s, 20 plus psi boost. And that's something that I realized, and that's why I kind of went ahead and installed that exhaust valve now, even though I don't really need it. I still need to install the a new fuel system, new injectors, which I already have. I just got to do that, and that's it. So kind of surprising. So if you look at the horsepower numbers, so with the exhaust cutout closed, we're getting 495 horsepower to the wheels versus 555 horsepower with the exhaust cutout open, and that's quite a difference actually. And that's not doing anything, that's just opening it up. There's no tune differences at all. So if you follow my videos, you might be wondering why this is so low, the 495. Well, it turns out that the boost pressure for this dyno, these dyno runs, was about 7.5. If you look at my previous video, I was getting around 527 at the wheels. The reason why is because the boost pressure, it turns out it wasn't around 7.5 that I thought it was actually around 8.5, and that's why we're getting an extra 30 horsepower more, and that makes sense. So this engine is really generating about 27 wheel horsepower per pound of PSI of boost. So if you add a PSI or two, you're going to get significantly more horsepower at the wheels. There you have it, everybody. If you're thinking about getting exhaust cutout, there's going to be some advantages. It's really designed for higher boost applications, higher horsepower applications, really to prevent the stock exhaust from really being a bottleneck in the system. I'm not sure if you really need it. If you're like around 10 psi of boost, I don't think you're going to need one. It's really if you're over 20 psi of boost, which I plan to be at in the near future. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them below. And I hope you have a great day. And please subscribe if you're not subscribed. See ya.